candle unburned, a silence too deliberate, and a death wrapped not in violence but in ritual and smoke. In the heart of a London winter, something ancient flickers beneath the surface, a mystery where symbols deceive and truth hides in wax and vapour. This is not merely a question of how, but why. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. The mystery begins now. It was in the final days of December, with London drowned in a damp, unwelcoming cold, that I found myself once more seated in the warm refuge of 221B Baker Street. Outside, the fog clung to the gas lamps like a mournful shroud, and the clatter of hansoms was muffled beneath a woolen hush of mist. Within, however, the fire crackled dutifully, and Holmes, wrapped in his robe and sunk deep in his armchair, smoked in absolute silence. I had long grown accustomed to his periodic descents into abstraction, but that evening his mood was different. He neither paced nor played the violin. He merely stared into the flames, unmoving, like a marble bust touched with melancholy. From beneath the shadow of his brow, Holmes blew a perfect ring of smoke and watched it drift ceilingward, as if it might carry away his thoughts. He had scarcely spoken a word since tea. No telegrams had arrived, no clients had called, and, most troubling of all, no fresh mysteries had stirred his interest. "Holmes," I ventured at last, "this silence of yours is becoming more oppressive than the weather." He responded only with a weary sigh. I recognised the signs well enough. When Sherlock Holmes had no puzzle to prod, his mind turned inwards, and that was always a dangerous direction. In a bid to stir him, I reached for the day's Gazette and read aloud an account of a curious scene at Lady Malvern's charity ball, where a viscount had apparently mistaken a duchess for a scullery maid and attempted to tip her. "A scandal of the highest sort," I said dryly. "Indeed," murmured Holmes, unmoved. "Shall we expect treason to follow?" I was about to retort when a firm rap echoed from the stairwell. Holmes sat up. "Ah," he whispered, "deliverance." Mrs. Hudson's familiar tread approached, and a moment later her voice announced, "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. He says the matter is private." Holmes and I exchanged a glance. "Show him in," he replied, rising with the peculiar alertness that overtook him when his faculties were summoned. Our visitor entered with a stiffness not unlike that of a marionette. He removed his gloves slowly, revealing hands, reddened and blistered at the tips, an odd detail that Holmes noted instantly but said nothing of. He was tall, thin, and impeccably dressed, yet there clung to him the unmistakable air of someone unaccustomed to being out in the night alone. His eyes darted about the room, then settled on Holmes with visible apprehension. "I must beg your discretion," he said at last, his voice taut. "This concerns a family matter, one of unusual delicacy." He set down a long, polished wooden box upon the centre table, its hinges bound with brass. "You have come to the right place," said Holmes. "And judging by the state of your fingers, sir, I suspect your concern is well-founded." The gentleman said nothing. His eyes dropped to the box, and for a moment he simply stood there, the silence growing longer and heavier. Holmes did not press him. He simply observed, arms folded, his gaze fixed not on the man's face, but on his shoes, his cuffs, the dried mud at the hem of his coat. At last, the man undid the latches with an audible click, but he did not open it. Instead, he rested both hands on the lid and looked up at Holmes. "My name is Sir Reginald Ponsonby Hale," he said, "and I believe my brother was murdered." Holmes said nothing at first, then softly, "Do sit down, Sir Reginald. We shall need to hear everything." Our guest had the look of a man who had aged too swiftly. Though well-groomed and dressed with meticulous care, there was something hollow in his eyes, and his hands, still trembling slightly, betrayed the tension he strove to conceal. "My name," he said, his voice measured but edged with fatigue. "Is Sir Reginald Ponsonby Hale of Windmir Hall in Shropshire?" Holmes offered a brief nod. "The name is not unknown to me," he murmured. "I have not come lightly, Mr. Holmes," Reginald continued, fingers tightening on the polished wood of the box before him. "There has been a death. My brother, Edmund. Natural? So they say. But you do not concur." "I do not," he said. "And I come not only with suspicions, but with reason. Reason hidden, perhaps, in this very box." Holmes' eyes flickered with interest. He leaned forward slightly, steepling his fingers. "Then pray begin at the beginning, Sir Reginald." Reginald took a breath, as if drawing resolve from the hearth's warmth. "My mother, God rest her, held certain traditions. Each year on her birthday, after her passing, my brother Edmund continued the observance. A candelabrum, 10-branched, cast in brass, would be set upon the mantel, one candle for each of her children, lit in the order of their birth." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "A curious rite." "We were 10, Reginald said quietly, "though not all remain. Continue." "This year's ceremony took place 3 evenings past. Edmund invited only those still living, myself, Cousin Henry, and Miss Annabel Trent, my late mother's companion. The others are gone or estranged." He paused. "We lit the candles, each of us in turn. There was wine, toasts. Then we retired. The candelabrum was left burning in the parlour, as always." Holmes nodded. "And in the morning?" "Only 9 candles remained lit. The 10th, mine, had been extinguished. No draught, no window open. It had simply gone out." "And your brother?" "Found dead in his study," Reginald finished, calm, seated upright, his eyes open. "They say it was apoplexy." "But you do not believe that," Holmes murmured. Reginald leaned back slightly, his gaze fixed on the box as though it might spare him the memory. "My brother was in robust health, Mr. Holmes. No prior ailments, no indication of collapse. The physician, an old friend of the family, declared it natural. I accepted nothing of the sort." "And the room?" Holmes asked. "Locked from the inside. No sign of struggle. The fire had gone out in the grate, but the air was still warm. His expression was surprised. Not frightened, precisely, but as though something had puzzled him in the final instant." "And the candle?" "Replaced by a fresh one," Reginald said. "Someone had removed the snuff taper and substituted it, deliberately, I believe. But the wax droppings on the carpet near the mantel told another story." Holmes nodded. "You are observant, Sir Reginald." "I was frightened," he replied. "Not for my life, but for the truth, and for the possibility that someone intended that candle's flame to die, before Edmund's did." Holmes shifted slightly in his chair, one hand now idly turning the stem of his pipe. "And your brother's estate?" he asked. Reginald hesitated. "Substantial. Our family has long held land and investments in Dorset and here in London. Edmund had no children. As the eldest surviving son, I would naturally be the heir." "But there is a complication," Holmes prompted. "There is. Edmund had, some years ago, hinted at altering his will. He distrusted Cousin Henry and felt guilt, I think, towards someone long excluded from the family. But no New Testament has been found. The solicitor possesses only the old will." "And who benefits most from the existing arrangement?" "Cousin Henry," said Reginald darkly. "He receives a considerable sum. I'm granted trusteeship, but the power lies with him." Holmes nodded slowly. "And this revised will, if it exists?" "Destroyed, I fear. Perhaps before it was signed. Or perhaps," Reginald added with a glance at the box, "it survives where no one has thought to look." "Then let us think differently," Holmes said. "Cousin Henry, Reginald went on, his voice low, is a man of refined appearance and unrefined means. He gambles badly and drinks quietly. A gentleman by breeding but not by habit. Watson frowned. Surely a motive, if inheritance is in question. There is more, Reginald said. 2 years ago, he attempted to extort money from Edmund using private letters, youthful indiscretions from Edmund's Oxford days. Edmund paid to keep them quiet, but after that, he grew cold toward Henry. Holmes tapped the box with his knuckle. And now Edmund is gone. The revised will is missing. The candle meant for you is snuffed out, and Henry stands to gain. Reginald's face was grim. I do not accuse without evidence, Mr. Holmes, but I know my brother. He would never have died peacefully with that man in the house. Holmes leaned back, fingertips pressed. We shall see what the wax remembers, Sir Reginald. Candles, like men, leave residue behind. There followed a brief silence, during which Holmes rose and circled slowly round our guest, not unlike a hound inspecting a scent trail. You arrived by train, he remarked, eyes narrowing. First class, though not recently accustomed to it. Your overcoat has traces of soot and portico salt. Paddington Station, likely. And the faint stain on your glove. Rosewood oil, used often in the preservation of aged parchment. Reginald looked startled. Yes, I keep a collection of rare documents, manuscripts, letters, treaties. It is a personal passion. Indeed, said Holmes, resuming his seat. And your fingers burnt, from handling melted wax, no doubt. 2 nights ago, Reginald confessed, I attempted to examine the original candelabrum. I thought I might find something. A wick cut too short, perhaps. In my nervousness, I tilted it and splashed hot wax across my hand. Curious, Holmes murmured. The object of death attempting to speak, but you lack the ears to hear it. Reginald sat straighter. Then you believe me? Holmes gave a faint smile. I believe you've come to the right place. Now let us examine what this box does not yet say aloud. Holmes turned his gaze back to the box. He leaned forward, opened the lid a fraction, then closed it again and sniffed. Rosewood, he said simply. Old and well oiled. Not merely furniture polish. No, this is preservation work. You have stored something of value within. Reginald looked away. Letters, mostly my mother's, and something else, which I dared not examine alone. Holmes's voice was soft now. It is often not the fire, but what it fails to consume, that tells the tale. I watched as Holmes opened his notebook and began to write without looking up. I should like to visit Windmir Hall, he said. Reginald nodded solemnly. It would be my honour. And so, by candlelight and suspicion, the case had begun. The following morning found us aboard the 10:14 express bound for Shrewsbury, our compartment chilled by the damp that clung to the windows like a second skin. Holmes, for his part, sat with chin in hand, silent throughout the ride save for an occasional hum. A half-finished tune with no discernible melody. I had grown accustomed to such spells of abstraction, but there was something more brooding in his manner that morning, as though the case had already whispered secrets to him I could not yet hear. Outside, Shropshire greeted us with a grey, lowering sky and meadows dulled beneath a film of frost. Our hired trap creaked its way through narrow lanes, the fields growing wilder the closer we came to Windmir Hall. Fog, Watson, Holmes murmured at last as we crested a wooded rise. The favourite ally of concealment. I glanced at him. Of murderers or truth? He smiled faintly. That distinction, my dear fellow, is what we are here to determine. Windmir Hall loomed up from the mist, like some slumbering relic of a forgotten era. Ivy-choked, angular, and watchful, we were met at the door not by Sir Reginald, but by a thin woman of rigid posture and colder countenance. Miss Annabel Trent, she introduced herself, with a voice more suited to reprimanding than welcoming. "You are here on behalf of Sir Reginald." "And on behalf of the late Sir Edmund," Holmes replied smoothly. She said nothing, only led us through a dim corridor smelling of polish and stone. Cousin Henry awaited us in the drawing room, reclining with studied ease beside the hearth. He did not rise, merely offered a languid, appraising glance. "Curious affair, this fuss over Edmund," he said. "You'll find the doctor's verdict quite sufficient." "Undoubtedly," Holmes returned. "But sufficient for whom, I wonder?" Henry's smirk vanished for a flicker of a second. Miss Trent cleared her throat. "We trust you won't be long, Mr. Holmes. The family has endured quite enough." Holmes's eyes darted once to a vase upon the mantel. "Truth is seldom patient, Miss Trent, but it tends to be persistent." Sir Reginald soon joined us and guided Holmes to the study, where Edmund's body had been found 3 nights prior. The room bore the air of arrested conversation, a chair turned slightly, an untouched glass on the sideboard, a single lamp unlit. Holmes circled slowly, fingers trailing lightly across surfaces as if interrogating the dust. "The room was locked?" "From within," Reginald confirmed. "We forced it open the following morning." Holmes knelt near the window. "Curious. Melted wax. 3 drops. Beneath the sill. The candle was moved or extinguished nearby." He examined the candelabrum with a jeweller's lens, then tapped the base of the 10th sconce with a fingernail. "There is a fine gouge here, Watson, not visible from above." I crouched beside him. Could that indicate tampering? More likely the hurried removal of a taper already softening under flame. He rose and examined the carpet. A faint track of residue here, traced from the candle's place toward the grate, and yet no soot upon the candle itself. Holmes straightened, face alight. "It is a stage, Watson, a stage on which someone played a silent part, and I believe the curtain rose before the fire had cooled." While Holmes busied himself with further examination, I took it upon myself to speak with the household staff, beginning with Mrs. Sims, the elderly housekeeper, whose years at Windmir outnumbered the family's dramas. "A sad business," she said, folding a cloth with more force than necessary, "but not altogether surprising." "How so?" I asked. She lowered her voice. "2 nights before Sir Edmund passed, I heard him arguing in the hallway. Not shouting, mind, but firm, tight and angry. The other voice was a woman's." "Miss Trent?" "No," she replied, shaking her head. "This one was younger, trembled when she spoke." "Did you see her face?" "Only her veil," she said. "Dark and drawn low. She came and went without a word to anyone else." I pressed her gently, but that was all she had seen. Still, it was enough to stir unease in me. By the time I returned to the study, Holmes was standing very still, his gaze fixed on a portrait wall. "One of them is missing," he said quietly. I followed his gaze and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the fog. Holmes moved along the far wall of the study with the same quiet intensity I'd seen him apply to the most confounding cases. His eyes flicked from frame to frame. I followed, more puzzled than enlightened. "Note the arrangement, Watson," he murmured. 10 portraits, or rather, 9. I frowned. There's certainly space for 10. Indeed. 5 on either side would maintain visual symmetry, but here the leftmost end is bare. Dust outlines where the frame once hung, the nail still intact. "Perhaps it was damaged," I ventured. "Or removed in haste," he replied. "And not for preservation." Reginald, who had just entered behind us, spoke in a low tone. "That was Beatrice." "Your sister?" I asked. "Our youngest," he said. "Declared dead after disappearing abroad some years ago. Estranged, more likely. Her name is not often mentioned." Holmes's brow darkened, and yet her portrait hung here beside the others, until recently. Curious. "She returned?" I asked. "I cannot say," Reginald replied. "But Edmund had written to someone he wished to include once more." Holmes turned back to the bare wall. Then that someone, Watson, may be the key to both a vanished candle and a vanished life. We rejoined Holmes in the parlour, where the box of ritual candles had been stored. It was an ornate chest lined with velvet, the brass latch well worn. Holmes opened it with reverence, lifting each candle between his fingers, weighing and sniffing in turn. "Curious," he muttered, pausing at the ninth. "This one bears a slightly darker hue. Feel it." I obeyed. Heavier. Precisely. Different composition. Likely from a separate batch, or manufactured with a unique blend. Notice the base. Unmarked, whereas the others carry the faint stamp of a Kensington chandler. He aligned them end to end. The wick is thicker as well. An insignificant detail to most, but not to the man who placed it here. "You think it was substituted?" "I would stake my Stradivarius on it," Holmes replied. "And one must ask, why replace a candle in a sacred ritual, unless one wished to alter more than mere wax?" Reginald entered just then. Holmes did not look up. Sir Reginald, who had access to this box before the ceremony? "No one but Edmund," he answered. Holmes smiled. Then either Edmund meant to send a message, or someone else reached it long before the first flame was ever struck. While Holmes continued his search, I wandered back into the study. Some nagging impression, drew me toward the fireplace. The coals were cold, the grate blackened and bowed with ash. I bent down, brushing aside the soot with my cane. A fragment of something crumbled beneath the touch, brittle and curled at the edges. "Holmes!" I called. He was beside me in moments. I held out the piece with a tentative hand. "Not paper," he murmured. "Vellum, scorched at one corner. Look here, faint ink, faded but not lost." He studied it beneath a lens, then lifted another fragment from the grate. Punctuation consistent with legal phrasing, a clause, possibly a codicil. Yes, a will. I stared. "You think this is what Edmund was preparing? Or what someone wished to destroy?" Holmes replied. "The ink was laid within days. He wrote it, Watson. Perhaps in haste, perhaps in fear. But someone ensured it would not survive." I looked again at the charred edge. "What does it say?" I asked. Holmes smiled without mirth, enough to suggest Beatrice was never so absent as the family pretended, and that her reappearance frightened someone very much indeed. Holmes rose slowly, brushing soot from his knees, and produced his pocketbook from within his coat. With his pencil, he began to scribble, quickly and without explanation. "What are you noting?" I asked. "Coordinates," he replied absently. "Not geographic, Watson. Social." I gave a puzzled grunt. "Where light is meant to shine equally upon all, but one corner is dimmed on purpose," he said. "It tells us who arranged the shadows." He tapped the pocketbook shut. "There's a missing light," he said, "and it is not merely a candle." Before I could question him further, he turned sharply on his heel and addressed Sir Reginald. "I shall require a list of all your mother's servants still living, including any who departed under less than cordial circumstances, and I should like to speak with your solicitor, quietly." Reginald blinked. "Have you discovered something?" Holmes adjusted his gloves. "Not yet, but something is preparing to reveal itself." And with that, he stepped back into the hall, his stride brisk, his mind already 3 moves ahead. Holmes had been uncharacteristically silent since our discovery near the fireplace. I followed him wordlessly as he moved with purpose down a narrow passage branching from the main corridor. At the end stood an unused guest chamber with an old walnut armoire, locked and dust-coated. "Reginald," Holmes said without turning, "this key, if you please." With a furrowed brow, Sir Reginald produced a tarnished brass key from his ring and handed it over. Holmes unlocked the cabinet and, with deliberate care, opened its creaking doors. Inside, leaning at a tilt between old ledgers and moth-eaten linen, was a portrait, the missing one. She was young, poised, with hair drawn back severely and eyes painted not in submission, but something nearer defiance. "Beatrice," Reginald whispered. "The estranged daughter," Holmes confirmed. "Removed from the wall, but not from history. She was meant to vanish, but not forgotten entirely. Someone hid this, but not to destroy it." He closed the armoire and turned to me. "Watson, the dead leave ghosts, but the living, they sometimes leave portraits." And for the first time in the case, I felt a chill not born of weather. We returned to the study, where Holmes opened his pocketbook and began writing furiously, pausing only to ask Reginald 3 questions, all variations of one. Who last saw Beatrice alive? "She left England nearly 12 years ago," Reginald replied. "Paris at first, then Vienna. She was a pianist, you see, but there were disagreements. Our father was less fond of music than of obedience." "And you received no word since?" "Not until last autumn," he said softly. "A letter, unsigned, but I recognized her script. She was in Surrey. She asked if Edmund still thought of her." Holmes closed the notebook. He did more than think, and with that, we took to the streets of the nearby village. Holmes inquired at the post office, then the vicar's, and finally, a tobacconist, all of whom remembered quite clearly a tall woman in mourning, always veiled, always alone. "It was at the greengrocer's that we heard it first. She signs the registry as Miss Clara Vale," the grocer's wife told us. Holmes's smile returned. "Vale, Latin for farewell. She was trying to vanish, Watson. That never works. The world remembers." On Holmes's insistence, we paid a visit to the village's only bookseller, a soft-spoken gentleman with spectacles thick enough to distort both eyes and judgment. "We've had few visitors this winter," he told us. "But yes, the veiled lady came twice, very particular in her requests." "What did she ask for?" Holmes inquired. "Volume 1 of Blackstone's Commentaries and a catalogue of estate law revisions." I was surprised. I'd not pegged her for a solicitor. "She wasn't," Holmes said. "She was preparing to become someone's heir." The bookseller blinked. "She left behind a scrap of notepaper, if that helps. She wrote down 3 names. Her own, I believe, Edmund's, and someone named Barrister Weldon." Holmes took the slip gently. "The man who drafted the late Sir Henry Goddard's will," he murmured. The pieces, it seemed, were aligning themselves with an eerie symmetry. A veiled woman, a hidden portrait, and now a legal mind sought in quiet desperation. As we left the shop, Holmes glanced back. "Watson," he said, "we no longer seek a ghost. We seek a woman made inconvenient by reappearance, and someone who profited from her absence." It was near dusk when we found the cottage, a modest dwelling tucked between yew trees, with a hedge grown wild around its edge. Holmes knocked gently. After a long pause, the door creaked open. There she stood, no longer a portrait or a whisper, but a woman of flesh and time. Her hair now streaked with silver, though her posture remained proud. She wore mourning still, but not as a performance. "Miss Vale?" Holmes asked. Her eyes flicked from him to me and back again. "Mr. Holmes," she said. I wondered how long it would take. She served us tea in silence. Holmes declined milk. I accepted it out of habit. She remained standing. "I've done no harm," she said after a long pause. "Only what was mine to reclaim." "We do not accuse," Holmes replied. "We only seek understanding." She nodded. "Then ask." "I shall," said Holmes, "but not yet. First, tell me this. When did Edmund last write to you?" She reached into a drawer and removed a letter, creased from handling. 3 weeks ago," she said. "He asked if I would come, and if I would forgive." Her hands trembled slightly as she handed it over. Holmes read the letter in silence, his eyes moving slowly, absorbing not only the words but the tone. When he finished, he handed it to me. The handwriting was firm, familiar, and unadorned. Dearest Beatrice, the time has come. I have told Reginald I intend to amend the will. Mother's dowry shall be yours as it always should have been. We meet on the 17th. Burn this. E. It arrived 2 days before the ceremony, Beatrice said softly. I came the following evening, but Edmund was changed, anxious. He told me to stay hidden until it was done. You stayed at the hall? I asked, startled. No, in the village, but he gave me the key to the East Orchard gate. He said if anything happened, I was to return to Vienna. I never got the chance to see him again. Did he mention Cousin Henry? Holmes asked. She looked away. Only that he was watching. Holmes rose. Miss Ponsonby, yes. Let us dispense with aliases. You are in danger, though not from the law. Then from whom? She asked. Holmes turned toward the window. From someone who knows the value of a candle, not for its light, but for the smoke it leaves behind. We parted ways with Beatrice that evening under a sky darkened not just by dusk, but by memory. Holmes walked ahead in silence, his coat pulled tightly around him, his steps measured and sharp. She is no murderess, Watson, he said at last. I never thought she was, I replied. But someone hoped we would, Holmes said. Not by direct accusation, but by elimination, erasing her from ceremony, record, portrait, and finally, legality. You mean the candle? And the will. He paused before the iron gate leading out of the orchard path. She represents not merely a scandal, but a threat to money, to history, to control. And yet, what power she retains. She frightens someone by surviving. That, my dear Watson, is rare. And dangerous? I asked. Holmes smiled grimly. Only to those who believe inheritance is safer when the rightful heir is dead. I said nothing further. The thought that one might remove another from existence not by murder, but by silence, chilled me in a way no knife ever could. That night, as Holmes pored over family letters by lamplight in the drawing room of Windmir Hall, I took to the hearth for warmth. The coals had long cooled, but the scent of smoke still lingered. I reached to adjust the poker and noticed a slight crunch beneath my boot. Bending low, I retrieved it. Another fragment of vellum, blackened along one edge and curled as though clawing itself away from flame. Holmes, I called. Another piece. He was at my side in seconds, tweezers in hand. Excellent, Watson. The fire does not consume all that it is given. He laid it gently beside the earlier fragments on the table and began arranging them with painstaking care. One line emerged clearly. To Beatrice Ponsonby, my sister, I bequeath another, less complete. In lieu of former testament, this shall, and that, Holmes murmured, is the voice of a dead man shouting through ash. Can we prove it was his hand? I asked. We may not need to, he replied. If the intention was there, and the motive to destroy it equally clear, then justice may still find its flame. And for the first time, I saw Holmes treat a scrap of burned paper with the reverence of a crown. Holmes continued working with surgical precision, matching fibres, interpreting scorched ink like an archaeologist piecing together a relic. It was no rough draft, he said. This was signed, though the name itself is gone. How do you know? Observe the flourishes in the lower corner, habitual in a man who signs often, confidently. Not a clerk, not a servant. Edmund, without question. I leaned closer. You truly believe this was the revised will? I do, and more importantly, so did the man who destroyed it. Holmes sat back, fingers pressed beneath his chin. The killer didn't merely want Edmund dead. He needed Beatrice's claim to vanish alongside him. A signature, a flame, and a single snuffed candle. He tapped the table softly. There is something poetic in it, Watson. Wickedly so. A symbolic extinguishment. Her portrait removed, her candle snuffed, her name burned. And yet she lives, I murmured. Which makes her dangerous, Holmes replied, because truth, when it returns, burns brighter than anything forged in secrecy. He closed his eyes for a moment. We have what we need. And the next step? I asked. He opened them again. We relight what someone tried so hard to extinguish. Holmes stood before the brass candelabrum the following morning, alone in the parlour. I found him staring at the 10th holder, the one meant for Reginald, the one found dark. Wax is an obedient servant, he said without turning. It burns when told, it snuffs when commanded, but this candle, this 10th candle, it never had the chance. He removed a taper from his pocket. A replacement, he explained, crafted differently. The wick shortened, the core tampered. It was never meant to burn fully, only appear to symbolize Reginald's exclusion, to frame him. No, Reginald was not the threat. Beatrice was. Her flame, her claim, her presence. This candle was her symbol, her resurrection, and someone extinguished it before it ever touched fire. I shuddered. An execution by wax. Holmes turned to me. Precisely, but they forgot one thing. What's that? That wax remembers. It leaves traces on floorboards, on hands, even in memory. And what is forgotten by the living is remembered by the flame. He paused, then struck a match. Time to see how it burns now, he said quietly. And as the wick caught, I could not help but feel the case itself had just reignited. 2 days later, we returned to Windmir Hall under markedly different circumstances. Holmes had written personally to each of the surviving family members, requesting their presence for what he called a final gesture of peace, a memorial ritual in honour of the late Sir Edmund. Cousin Henry arrived in a dark frock coat, his expression tight with suspicion, while Miss Annabel Trent appeared in full mourning, her lips pressed so thin they nearly vanished. Sir Reginald, now visibly aged by the strain of the investigation, stood by the candelabrum with a look of subdued anticipation. Holmes addressed them without preamble. We are gathered, he said, to repeat, in solemnity, the ritual last performed in this very room. A gesture of memory and closure. All details will be observed precisely. I ask your indulgence for one variation only. I shall oversee the lighting of each candle personally. There were a few glances exchanged, but no objections voiced. Miss Trent sniffed. If it spares further gossip in the village, then so be it. Holmes bowed slightly. Indeed. Let us then honour the dead. He met my eye as he turned. His look said plainly, Now, Watson, the play begins. Before the others had arrived, Holmes had requested privacy under the pretext of preparing the chamber. I was permitted to remain, not out of preference, I suspect, but out of logistical necessity. With the door firmly shut, Holmes produced a small leather case containing an assortment of candle tapers, finely wrapped and labelled. We shall replace the ritual candles, he said simply. All of them? I asked. All but one, he replied, and that one, the 10th, I have treated specially. He then marked the base of each candle with a minute symbol visible only under magnification, a triangle, a dot, a crescent, and so on. The 10th bore a double ring. They burn identically, he said, but this one will speak. To whom? To the air itself, Watson, and the air, in turn, will betray a murderer. Once the candles were arranged, and the scentless agent laced carefully within the hollow of the 10th taper, Holmes set the room precisely as it had been that fateful evening. Chairs at their original angles, curtains slightly parted, even a faint draught engineered by adjusting the sash of the western window. There, he said, brushing his hands. The theatre is set. Let us hope the villain has not rewritten the script. And then the guests arrived. The room filled slowly, but with none of the comfort or familiarity one might expect from a family gathering. Reginald stood stiffly, while Henry leaned in a corner with folded arms, the very picture of reluctant patience. Miss Trent clutched a handkerchief, though she shed no tears. Holmes gestured to the candelabrum. "As before," he said, "we shall proceed in birth order. I shall light each candle in your name." There was a murmur of assent. Holmes struck a match. The first candle flared to life, then the second, the third. At each name, he paused solemnly. By the time he reached the ninth, the room had grown markedly still. Each flame seemed to burn with quiet purpose, their light casting faint shadows against the bookshelves. Finally, Holmes stood before the 10th candle. "This one," he said, "was once extinguished." There was a pause. "But tonight it shall burn." With a final flick of his wrist, he touched the match to the wick. The flame caught, but not as expected. It sputtered, it hissed, and a faint, acrid scent rose into the air, just as Holmes had predicted. A sharp inhalation came from someone behind me, and in that moment, I knew the trap had sprung. The reaction was immediate. The 10th candle, unlike its companions, danced erratically in its holder, emitting a sharp, unnatural odour. Neither floral nor woody, but something chemical, pungent, and disturbingly familiar. Miss Trent recoiled. "What on earth?" Reginald looked alarmed, though more at the expression on Holmes's face than the candle itself. But it was Henry whose reaction betrayed him. He stepped backward with a force that tipped the leg of the armchair behind him, his eyes darting to the candelabrum, then to Holmes, then to the window. Holmes was already moving. "No need for panic," he said evenly. "We are in no danger. The compound was neutralized for demonstration, but the original was quite lethal." He pointed. "That candle, when burned, released a substance into the air, volatile, near invisible, and deadly in close proximity. It was designed not merely to extinguish light, but to extinguish life." Henry swallowed. "This is madness." Holmes turned slowly to face him. "No, Mr. Ponsby," he said. "This is science and justice." The room held its breath. The candle sputtered once more, then steadied. But the tension did not, and what came next would burn hotter than wax. Holmes moved slowly to the armchair where Sir Edmund had once sat, its leather seat still faintly indented from the weight it had borne. He gestured for silence and retrieved a folded handkerchief from his coat. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, leaning close to the right armrest. There, barely visible in the candlelight, was a faint smear, oily, translucent, and glistening oddly where the candle's acrid smoke had drifted. Holmes dabbed the mark carefully. "This," he announced, "is residue, a chemical trace activated by the candle's heat. The room's arrangement tonight mirrors that of Sir Edmund's final evening. The 10th candle's fumes would have risen just so, and here is the evidence it left." Reginald looked bewildered. Miss Trent, however, clutched her kerchief tighter, but Henry had gone entirely still. "The substance," Holmes added, "was not visible before, not to the eye, nor even under ordinary conditions. But when it met the compound I prepared tonight," he let the implication hang. I shivered. A man had sat there and died, and only now, days later, did his chair whisper the truth. Holmes turned deliberately, his eyes narrowing on Cousin Henry. "I believe," he said, "you were the last to approach the candelabrum on the night of the tragedy." Henry scoffed, but the sound rang hollow. "To steady it," he muttered. "It wobbled." "Ah, yes," Holmes replied smoothly. "A noble act, made all the easier by your foreknowledge of which candle had been altered." Holmes walked back to the table where the leather case of tapers still lay. He extracted one, the original 10th candle, charred and marked. "This," he said, "was not tampered with by accident. Its hollow was drilled, refilled, and sealed with resin. And the wick was dipped in a substance sourced not from any reputable supplier, but from a chemist whose name appears, rather inconveniently for you, in this receipt." He held up a paper. Henry's complexion paled visibly. You had motive, Holmes continued. Your inheritance was minor, barely enough to cover your debts. Debts documented by pawn slips I shall shortly present. But if Sir Edmund died intestate, or with Beatrice removed from the will, your share grew considerably. Henry made a strangled noise. And so, Holmes concluded, you ensured both Edmund and the will disappeared by wax and fire. There was silence, then movement. Henry sprang forward, knocking over a small side table as he surged toward the door. "Out of my way!" he roared. Reginald recoiled. Miss Trent shrieked, but Holmes, as ever, was unflinching. "He won't get far," he said. I arranged for an escort. As if on cue, the front doors flew open and a figure stepped through. Tall, uniformed, and resolute. Constable Doran, a reliable fellow from the village, had clearly been waiting for such a moment. Henry halted, briefly, then made a desperate feint to the left. Doran caught his arm mid-motion, twisting it expertly behind his back. "I suggest you don't struggle," the constable said calmly. "My grip improves under pressure." Holmes stepped beside them. "Mr. Ponsby, you might have escaped suspicion had you possessed less chemistry and more restraint." Henry said nothing. His breathing was ragged, shoulders hunched. Holmes turned to Doran. "Take him to the station. Inform Inspector Rexley he'll require both a solicitor and a chemist's ledger." The constable nodded and led Henry out, still protesting, though his words were already crumbling into mutters. And so, the hall fell still again, save for the candle. It burned on. Holmes gestured for us to gather, now that Henry had been removed. His tone grew more instructive, like a professor concluding a particularly sinister lecture. "The compound," he began, "was an alkaloid derivative, colourless, odourless until burned, and highly reactive in enclosed spaces. It enters through the mucous membranes, slows the heart, and mimics the symptoms of natural cardiac failure." Reginald blinked. "So, Edmund simply passed in his chair?" Holmes nodded. "Exactly as the murderer intended. No struggle, no marks. And once the candle was extinguished, prematurely, I might add, the room returned to peace. The trace had done its work." "And the smell tonight?" I asked. Holmes gave a small smile. "A variant. I modified the residue to emit a signal. Acrid, unmistakable. The original toxin left no such signature. It was, in every sense, a silent killer." Miss Trent looked faint. "But why the candle?" Reginald asked. "Why not poison the wine?" Holmes tapped the candelabrum lightly. "Because this method left no trail. No glass, no residue, no fuss. A burnt-out wick. A snuffed flame. And beneath it, a man whose heart had simply ceased." He paused. "Sometimes, Watson, murderers are chemists first and cowards second." I had no reply to that. Holmes laid the last of his evidence upon the table with a certain finality. "The pawn tickets," he said, "were recovered from Mr. Ponsby's lodgings. Items listed include a silver locket, a pair of cufflinks bearing the family crest, and, rather tellingly, a ceremonial brooch once gifted by Sir Edmund himself." Miss Trent gasped. "He sold the family heirlooms." "To finance the murder, one presumes," Holmes replied, "though I suspect he wagered much of it away. His debts were not merely financial, but social. And desperation breeds recklessness." He lifted a small envelope. This, however, was the key. A receipt from Taverner's apothecary in Belgravia, dated precisely 3 days before the fatal ceremony, listing a purchase of Compound C, powdered form, handle with gloves. "Compound C?" I asked. "A neurotoxin known only to specialists, difficult to obtain, difficult to trace, and entirely illegal." Reginald groaned and sank into a chair. "To think, under our roof," Holmes nodded, "under all your noses, and yet it took only a trace of smoke, a burned wick, and a whisper from an armrest to find him out. The candelabrum still glowed softly beside us. Holmes extinguished the 10th flame, and with it, the last shadow of the lie. We arrived back at Baker Street well after midnight. The fog, persistent and clinging, seemed reluctant to release its hold on the city, but within the sitting room, the familiar crackle of the hearth and the scent of Holmes' tobacco restored a measure of calm. Holmes removed his coat, with the absent precision of a man whose thoughts had already leapt ahead. For a murder executed by candlelight, I began, easing into my chair opposite him. It was damned theatrical. Holmes gave a faint smile. Murder, my dear Watson, is often an art before it is a crime. The trouble begins when the artist grows impatient. I lit my pipe and watched the smoke curl toward the ceiling. Holmes had already taken to his violin, drawing idle notes across the strings. You had it from the start, I said. He paused, bow mid-air. I had suspicions, but it was the wax that spoke, not the man. He set the violin aside and turned his gaze to the fire. It is astonishing, he said softly, how quickly a flame consumes both wax and truth, but the residue always betrays the fire. A log shifted in the grate. We said no more, but I knew he was far from finished. Holmes rose, retrieved his notebook from the mantel, and flipped it open. You recall, Watson, he said, the candelabrum fixed to the eastern wall of Windmir's great hall? I nodded. Barely. It seemed ordinary enough. Precisely, but there was a scratch, barely visible, beneath the brass sconce holding the 10th taper, a groove no longer than a fingernail's width, yet deep enough to have been etched by a tool. I leaned forward. A tampering? Holmes tapped the notebook. A mechanism, subtle and malicious. The assassin, let us now call him by his rightful designation, embedded a slender coil beneath the socket, designed to accelerate the draw of air around the wick. In effect, it hastened combustion. But why not simply light the candle earlier? I asked. Holmes chuckled. Because a premature ignition would have raised suspicion. A faster burn concealed within a normal flame, however, that is cunning. The altered candle would expire several minutes before the rest, releasing its vapours just as the family settled into reminiscence. I shook my head. Ingenious. Diabolical, Holmes corrected. And yet, like all clockwork, it left signs. The faint scratch, the inconsistent burn pattern. The killer's subtlety was his own undoing. He closed the notebook. Even wax, he said, can be impatient to speak. Holmes stepped to the bureau where, earlier that evening, he had placed the remaining candles from Windmir. Wait, he said, lifting one between thumb and forefinger, is the most honest of witnesses. It lies for no one. He handed it to me. What do you observe? I turned it over, felt its heft. Ordinary, I began, then stopped. No, I corrected myself. There's a slight imbalance. The base feels denser. Holmes nodded approvingly. The killer drilled into the core of one taper, filled it with the powdered toxin, and resealed it. The sealing wax, though skillfully applied, bore a faint discoloration when placed beside its untainted brethren, and the weight, as you note, was inconsistent by less than a dram. He held up his own pair of brass scales. Enough to elude casual handling, but not enough to elude scrutiny. I glanced at the other candles. So you weighed each? I asked. Of course. The substitution was subtle, but chemical alteration alters mass, Watson. Always. When the physical fails, the forensic answers. He returned the candle to its place. To the naked eye, they were identical, but truth, like wax, holds memory in its weight. And with that, he reached for his pipe. The examination, it seemed, had only deepened his reflection. Holmes leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers, the flickering hearth dancing in his gaze. The toxin, he said at last, was powdered belladonna, extracted, distilled, and pressed into wax. I sat upright. Belladonna, but surely that would have left signs. Ingested, yes, he replied, but vaporized, quite a different matter. The killer relied on the low combustion point of the compound. As the candle burned, the heat transformed the powder into an invisible fume, one that, when inhaled in sufficient concentration, slows the heart and distorts the nervous system. He paused, as though reading from an invisible textbook. Sir Edmund's symptoms: mild perspiration, twitching of the fingers, a sudden collapse, all perfectly consistent with a cardiac event. And yet the cause was neither age nor ailment, but a chemical ghost rising from wax. I stared into the fire, troubled. And there's no antidote, not when inhaled in such concentration, and not when no one suspects foul play. Holmes exhaled. That is what made the method so infernally clever. It needed no delivery, no trace, no lingering aftertaste, only a flame. And patience. He drew on his pipe. Poison by candlelight, Watson, he said. A murder that masqueraded as memory and passed itself off as grief. I could think of no response, only silence. Holmes remained at the mantel, his gaze fixed upon the dying embers. There was something almost poetic in his method, he said at last. A candle snuffed not by fingers, but by artifice and slow deceit. A death dressed in symbolism. I frowned. Symbolic. Indeed, 10 candles, 10 memories, and the last, extinguished not by mourning hands, but by murder. He wished not only to kill Watson, but to make a point, that even memory, when inherited, can be corrupted. He turned slightly. Henry could not strike with a knife. That would have been too crude. But a flame, a whisper of poison beneath wax, that, to his mind, elevated the act beyond crime, into intention. I recalled the meticulous way Henry had read his speech, the rehearsed sorrow, the deliberate gesture of lighting the 10th candle. He wanted to control how Edmund was remembered, I said. More than that, Holmes replied. He wanted to rewrite the ending. I shivered. A quiet death, witnessed by family, and yet arranged like theatre. Holmes sat again. It is often in silence that the most deliberate noises are concealed. He closed his eyes for a moment. The alchemy of intention, Watson, where murder masquerades as ritual. It was some time before Holmes spoke again. When he did, his voice was low, almost introspective. Beatrice Windmir, he said slowly, showed more fortitude than any among them. I glanced at him. You think she knew? She suspected, Holmes said. She lacked proof, but she had the instinct of one who has lived long in shadow. He picked up the handkerchief she had left on the armrest, faintly scented with lavender. She lived her life quietly, dutifully, and, in many ways, unjustly, he continued. The world does not know what to do with intelligent women who ask for nothing, so it gives them less than nothing in return. I nodded, moved despite myself. She thanked me, Holmes added, with a wordless nod, not for justice, for the recognition of what she had long suspected and never voiced. Do you think she'll speak of it? No, he replied. Nor should she need to. Some truths are best carried in silence, not for shame, but for strength. There was an uncharacteristic softness in his voice. In a society that rewards noise, Watson, dignity is often mistaken for absence. But she was the only one who truly mourned the man, not the fortune. Holmes did not look at me. He didn't need to. Later, as I reviewed my notes, I found myself flushed with quiet embarrassment. I must confess, I said, I had thought the whole ritual rather harmless, eccentric perhaps, but moving. Holmes smiled faintly. It was meant to seem so. That is what makes it dangerous. I mean, I fumbled. The 10 candles, the recitations, the sentimentalism. It all struck me as so sincere, So obviously harmless that you nearly missed it, Holmes finished for me. As did they all. I nodded. Had you not insisted on inspecting the wax, and had I not followed you blindly as ever, the truth might never have surfaced. Holmes regarded me kindly, which from him felt like thunderous praise. You have a good heart, Watson. It is both your handicap and your advantage. I could not tell whether to be flattered or scolded. But let this remain with you, he added. Evil does not always wear a mask of malevolence. Sometimes it comes cloaked in warmth, in ritual, in remembrance. I sat back, humbled. And yet, he said lightly, you do write a compelling obituary, old friend. I laughed despite myself. You do know how to wound with affection. Holmes stood finally and stretched. He walked to the table and took up the altered candle, turning it slowly in his fingers. You see, Watson, he said, even symbols, those grand gestures we drape over meaning, leave forensic footprints. He held it up to the light. This was not merely wax, it was a signature, a confession disguised as ritual. The killer could not help but express himself, even in poison. Like a painter, I murmured, who leaves his brushstroke. Precisely, and a clever one at that, but still human, still prone to overconfidence, to the poetry of his own method. He placed the candle back. You may find this curious, he added, but it was not the murder that interested me most. I raised an eyebrow. No. It was the vanity behind it, the belief that art can erase motive, that symbolism can purify crime. He turned to me, and his eyes, usually so cold, held a glint of something brighter. Not warmth, exactly, but clarity. Give me facts, Watson, but never forget. Symbols lie. Chemistry does not. And with that, Holmes reached for his violin once more, its strings ready to sing beneath the same hands that had unstrung a killer's masquerade. The wind had begun to settle as we returned to Baker Street, the gas lamps casting long amber streaks upon the pavement. Within our parlour, the evening lay heavy, but not oppressive, like the pages of a book recently closed, yet lingering in the mind. Holmes sat in his accustomed chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes half closed in that curious state between stillness and calculation. I had offered him a brandy, which he refused with a wave of the hand, gesturing instead toward the fire, as if its low rhythmic crackle was more to his taste. There are nights in Baker Street when no words are necessary, only the shared understanding between two men who have once more peered into the murk of deceit and returned not quite untouched. This was one of those nights. Outside, the fog crept gently along the panes. Inside, Holmes remained silent, the flickering hearth mirroring something in his eyes. On the small table beside him lay a solitary candle, ivory white, unlit, unblemished. Holmes took it in hand and turned it slowly, his thumb brushing along the wick with a curious tenderness. There's a certain irony, Watson, he said, in the things that do not burn. I looked up from my chair. You mean the candle? He gave a slight nod. A candle that never sees flame, never reveals its nature. No heat, no wax, no truth. I frowned. But surely it's harmless. Holmes smiled faintly. Perhaps, or perhaps, the most dangerous things are precisely those that never burn. They remain untested, unexamined, deceiving by their very dormancy. He set the candle down again. Light reveals, but it also blinds. One must always ask, what are we not meant to see? The unlit taper lay there, silent, plain, and suddenly not so innocent. Holmes leaned back and regarded the fire. Have you ever considered, he said softly, that fire behaves more rationally than mankind? I raised an eyebrow. How do you mean? A flame consumes what it must, obeying laws of chemistry and air. It hungers, yes, but never lies. It flares when provoked and dies when starved. A predictable beast. And men, he said, are less rational than flame. They destroy not from necessity but from vanity, fear, sentiment. They do not burn to survive, they burn to be seen. There was something almost mournful in his tone. Henry believed he could control memory by scripting its end. But memory is no candle, Watson. It does not obey the match. I watched him for a moment, unsure whether he spoke of Henry or some deeper ache only he could name. Still, Holmes added, there is something beautiful in the attempt. We spoke little more of the Windmir affair. The facts were now tidy, the culprit dead, the motive understood. And yet, as Holmes often remarked, neatness was no guarantor of satisfaction. Beatrice will be safe now, I said, more to myself than to him. Holmes gave a slight incline of the head. Safe, yes, but not whole. Grief, unlike poison, leaves no autopsy. And Henry? He paused before answering. A clever man. Too clever, perhaps, but his tragedy was not his mind. It was his heart, which he disguised too thoroughly. I nodded. Justice, at least, has been served. Holmes replied, it has been done. Whether it has served anyone remains to be seen. I found no reply to that. Only the ticking of the mantel clock offered response. Measured, impartial, and unaware of the human frailties it marked, Holmes rose at last, stretching with the elegant weariness of one whose mind had run far ahead of the body. He turned toward the stairs, then paused, glancing at the candle once more. Do remind me, he said dryly, to buy a fresh box of candles, Watson, preferably untampered this time. I chuckled. I shall inspect the wicks myself. Then heaven help us, he murmured, vanishing up the steps. Left alone, I sat with the fire a moment longer, the shadows now soft and familiar. The candle remained unlit, but I fancied I saw it tremble, ever so slightly, in the warmth, somewhere beyond the veil of smoke and silence. Another case stirred, another quiet knock upon the door, another flicker awaiting flame. And so I set down my pen, knowing full well it would not remain still for long. Holmes leaned back in his chair, the glow of the hearth flickering against his angular features. His fingers steepled beneath his chin, and for a long moment he regarded the silent room as though communing with a thought too delicate for words. At times, he said at last, the cleverest murder is not the one that leaves no evidence, but the one so poetic, so deliberate, that even death becomes a performance. Our culprit chose symbolism over silence, and in doing so, sealed his own fate. I nodded thoughtfully, still replaying the scene in my mind, the candle, the vapours, the sequence of precision masked as coincidence. And to think, I murmured, it could all have passed unnoticed, had you not caught that faint trace of wax. Holmes gave a half smile. In the theatre of crime, Watson, even wax has a voice. What do you think was the most damning clue, the one mistake that brought the killer undone? Let us know in the comments, and if this tale left a chill along your spine, do subscribe for more of Holmes' most curious adventures. Share the mystery with a friend. After all, even shadows reveal more when seen together.